Okay, folks, I've got 2:03 on my clock, so we're going to go ahead and get going. So first off, guys, welcome. This is the first of hopefully many webinars that we're going to be doing relating to floodplain management. This is Nfip 101, an introduction to floodplain management. I am Alex Van Pelt. I'm the one presenting today. I'm also going to be moderating myself. My moderator, unfortunately, was not able to make it today. So there might come a time or two where I am going back and forth doing something else, but I'm going to try and keep talking pretty much the whole time, guys. Little about me, I am the Kentucky Nfip coordinator, or essentially I'm the state floodplain coordinator. My job here at the Division of Water is to help you guys at the local community level manage your floodplains. So whether that be floodplain mapping, issuing permits, insurance questions, things like that. I have my hand in a little bit of everything. So today, as we get going, there's a couple things I want to cover kind of right off the bat. The first thing, guys, is you'll notice either whether you're using the web browser or the GoToMeeting app, on the right side of your page, you're going to have your controls. There's a couple in particular I want to call out. The first one is going to be your audio controls. Today I have everybody muted, or I'm trying to keep everybody muted. That way we're not listening to you all talk in your office. So everybody should be on mute but me, so you can hear me, but I cannot hear you guys. So if you have questions, if you have comments, please use that chat function feature there in the control panel. You can send the chats either directly to me, or you can send them to everyone. It doesn't really matter which. As I go, like I said, I don't have a moderator today, so I'm going to be monitoring that chat feature myself, and I'm going to try and answer your all's questions kind of as we go. There's a couple good spots I have where we're going to talk in transitions about some of the Q&A, so I'm going to try and do it as we go. If not, I'm going to try and answer everything at the end of the webinar. The last thing, guys, is that earlier this morning, you all should have got an email from me. I emailed out some handouts. So I had emailed out a PDF of the slides we're going to cover and a list of acronyms for everyone to refer to. And I did this because since this is an introductory webinar, introductory to floodplain management, I don't want people to be confused kind of as we go. So the slides are there so you can flip back and forth as we go. If there's something that I previously discussed and you want to go back to and look while we're talking, you can do that. And then the acronyms are there just in case I slip up. I'm going to try and pronounce all the acronyms out. But, the list is there for you to refer to as we go. So today we're going to talk about several things. So why do we care about floodplains? Why is this something we concern ourselves with? And we're also going to talk about what is a flood and what is a floodplain. Those are terms that mean different things to different people. We're going to talk about the Nfip, or the National Flood Insurance Program. What is it? What are its goals? We're going to talk about the maps, flood insurance rate maps, and the flood insurance studies. We're going to talk about the Nfip requirements. So, what do you have to do as part of the Nfip? We're going to discuss local floodplain ordinances and local floodplain permitting. We're going to talk about stakeholders, who's interested in the floodplains, who actually cares about this stuff. We're going to talk about the community rating system. We're going to talk about mitigation. We're going to talk about some floodplain tools that you all can use in your daily jobs or as you go about. And then we're going to talk about other trainings there at the end. So this is an introductory one. There are more that go way more in depth than some of these other ones. So as we go along, guys, like I said, I'm going to try and pronounce everything, but if I slip up, be sure to use your handouts and slides. So why do we care about floodplains? If any of you have heard me or seen me speak before, you'll recognize this slide, but it's pertinent because floodplains are inherently dangerous areas. These are the areas that are most likely to flood. They're at the highest risk. So they're areas where we want to avoid during times of high water. From 96 through 2017, Kentucky had 78 flood deaths. And that is a significant number when you think about Kentucky as compared to the rest of the country. You know, we have 1% of the U.S. population, but that 78 deaths accounts for about 4% of the people that died in that time frame. And if you look at the map there at the bottom of the slide, there's really not one area that's, you know, any better than the other. You know, it really is a risk that is throughout the entire Commonwealth. That map, what it's showing is every county highlighted in red with a number in it is showing you where there has been at least one, if not more, flood deaths during that period. And it really is the entire state. At the local level, when we're talking about floodplain management, really what we're talking about is public safety. You know, what we're doing is we're trying to empower people by giving them the knowledge and the information to take action to protect themselves or to reduce their risk. And there are several different ways this can be done. So this could be something as simple as, you know, putting up signs, hey, high water in this area, you know, flood hazard areas, putting up high water marks like that picture on the far right. This is also done, you know, with ad campaigns like Turn Around, Don't Drown, or social media outreach, things like that. You know, putting information in the hands of people so they can act on it. Really, it's about making people able to protect themselves. So when we're talking about floods, you know, floods mean different things to different peoples. FEMA has one definition, the Army Corps of Engineers has a different definition, and I would venture to guess most of you have an idea of when I say the word flood, what does that actually mean? Well, there are several different things. For our purposes, when we're talking about floodplain management, really what we're talking about is a temporary condition. So, you know, it's an area that's normally dry that is inundated with water. So it has to be either 2 or more acres of dry land or 2 or more adjacent properties. So if you're in a city or, you know, a small town or something like that, and you have 1/8 of an acre lots, if 2 lots side by side have water on them that are normally dry, that is considered a flood. If you have a farmer's field where more than 2 acres has water on it that's normally dry, that is a flood. It doesn't have to be these big events where, you know, the water is several feet deep and is affecting long stretches of rivers or something like that. It really can be smaller at a local scale. So flood, when we say that flood term, you know, we are talking about the big ones that everyone kind of imagines in their head when they hear it. But floods can be very small and very localized as well. Same way, when we're talking about floodplain, what are we talking about there? Well, the floodplain is that low-lying area adjacent to a river or stream that's, you know, occasionally inundated with water. You know, on an average stream, within the banks of the river, or within the banks of the, you know, creek itself, that area can only handle about a 1 or 2 year storm, which means a storm that's big enough that it only happens every 1 or 2 years. But we regulate floods all the way up to the 100-year flood. Where does that other 98% of the water go? Well, it goes off into the floodplain. The floodplain really is kind of the relief valve that allows water to travel downstream without being constricted. It really is the overflow. Within the floodplain itself, there is another area I want to kind of call your attention to as we go, and that is going to be your floodway. So when I say the term floodway, what I'm still talking about the floodplain itself. It's just a part of the floodplain. The floodway is the area that carries the most water. It carries it at the highest velocities, and generally is considered the most dangerous area of the floodplain during a flood. This area has some additional conditions that we're going to talk about later. The key here, though, is just when I say floodway, realize I'm still talking about the floodplain. It's just a very specific portion of it. Okay, so looking at the chat, I don't see any questions yet. Again, guys, if you do have questions about something I'm covering as we go, please write them in that chat feature so I can address them during these transition slides. Since we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and just move on. And we're going to start talking about the National Flood Insurance Program. So before the NFIP, or before the National Flood Insurance Program came about, Floodplain management in this country has really been about controlling the floodwater, or controlling where the floodwater itself goes. This is done several different ways. So this is done with us constructing dams to levees and flood walls to hold back water out of certain areas, reservoirs to retain or detain water to allow it to flow downstream more slowly, or with actual channel modifications itself. So doing things like these rock dikes or horseshoe dikes, or dredging operations for navigation or something like that. It's really been about controlling the water and where it goes, making it go where we want. The problem with this is, all of these operations, all of these structures are very expensive, not just to build, but to maintain over time. And Mother Nature is relentless. She is going to win that fight all day, hands down. About 50 years ago, it kind of got to the point where we realized, okay, this isn't really working the way we want it to. We've not really tamed the water, so we need to try something else. And so that's where the Nfip came in. So in 1968, Congress passed the National Flood Insurance Act, which created the National Flood Insurance Program. The program is designed to provide insurance in communities that voluntarily adopt and enforce floodplain management ordinances. So basically, it's, we need to manage these areas. We need to set requirements for people to, when you build or do something in these areas, that you're taking action to protect yourselves. And then, when these floods still do happen, to provide insurance, to take the burden off of the property owner and off of the federal government for having to come in and rescue these people. The Nfip, or the National Flood Insurance Program, is a voluntary program. No community has to participate. It is completely optional. Most do, though, because there are several advantages to doing it. The way it works is, like I said, the community agrees to adopt and enforce floodplain management ordinance, basically setting development standards for areas that are at risk of flooding. No matter how high you set those standards, though, there is a level of residual risk that you can never really make go away. So the flood insurance is there to transfer that risk off of the property owner onto the Nfip, the program. And the goal of the program is to reduce future flood damages. It accomplishes this goal with four main steps. So one is identifying your flood risks. These are our floodplain maps. Where are the areas where it's most likely to flood? Once you know where those high-risk areas are, then we say, okay, in those areas, we're going to regulate development. We're going to set some standards that you have to take to protect yourself. So this would be, requiring people to build up or setbacks or something like that. But again, no matter how high you set those standards, there's a residual risk that doesn't go away. So if you build your house 20 feet above the floodplain and a tree washes downstream and bangs into it, it's still got damaged by flood. So the insurance is there is really to put you whole when these events happen. But the last one is the mitigation. There has been European settlers living in Kentucky since the mid-1700s or early 1700s. We've only been regulating the floodplains since the late 60s, about 50 years. So when we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about taking actions to reduce risk for structures that are already at risk. So whether that be relocating them out of the floodplain, tearing them down, elevating them up, doing something so that their risk is reduced. The best way to think about the Nfip really is to think of it as a four-legged stool. You've got the four legs: the identification and mapping, the management, the insurance, and the mitigation. All four legs really do hold the program up. If you take one of them away, the program becomes unbalanced and is, wants to topple. It doesn't work as well. It has to have all four parts for it to function. Okay. So still doesn't look like we have had any questions come in, guys, so I'm going to go ahead and keep on moving. So next we're going to transition. That was the, covering the Nfip at the real high level. Now we're going to kind of drill into it a little bit more and go into a little bit more detail. So I just showed this slide. We're going to actually dig into that first leg of the stool. We're going to talk about floodplain identification and mapping. So flood maps do several things right off the bat. The number one thing they do is they identify areas that have a high, a moderate, and a low risk of flooding. So if you look at that picture on the right, the areas in blue, or the areas in that blue-red hash mark, those are the areas that are considered the floodplain. They're the areas where they have the highest risk of a flood happening. Those are the areas where we have development requirements. Moderate risk areas are those areas kind of shown there on the edge in that gold beige color. Those areas still have a chance of flooding, but it's less than the 1% per year that we regulate to. And then everything else, all the areas without any coloring, those are our low risk areas. But keep in mind, low risk does not mean the same thing as no risk. Anywhere it rains, it can flood. About a year ago, I was in Phoenix, and they had their first rain in 100 days, and it flooded. So just because it doesn't rain often or it's a low risk area, it doesn't mean a flood can't still happen. If it rains, it can flood. These maps are also really good about communicating flood hazard information to people in your communities. So letting them know, hey, these areas are regulated. These areas require insurance. These areas are risky. Let them know, put that information in their hands so they can take action. Maps are also used for floodplain management decisions. So that's at the state level, we issue floodplain permits, and then at the local level, the local floodplain coordinator issues permits as well using these maps. Lenders use them to determine when insurance is required with a federally backed mortgage. So if you live in that high risk area and you go to get a loan backed by the FDIC, you have to carry flood insurance to protect that loan. It's not optional. And then insurance agents use these maps to rate insurance policies. So there are several different things, like I said, that the flood maps do kind of right off the bat. FEMA is the group responsible for actually putting together the flood insurance rate maps for all the communities in Kentucky. Division of Water, we are a cooperating technical partner with FEMA, which essentially means that FEMA provides us funding and we create the maps on their behalf to their standards. And the reason we do this is because we feel like we have a better handle on where the needs lie when it comes to these floodplain mappings. Where are the areas that haven't had maps done in a while? Where are the areas where we know we have problems? And so we're able to kind of spend our time and money and effort in these areas to make sure the maps are as accurate as they can be. When you're looking at the maps, the flood insurance rate maps, there are several things that it shows you when you're looking at them. So number one thing being the 1% chance or greater area of flooding. These are formerly what we used to call the 100-year floodplains. We don't use that term anymore. Now they're the 1% chance flood. Those are the areas shown in blue or in that blue-red hash mark that I showed on the previous slide. Those are the areas that we regulate to. In addition to that, they also show base flood elevations and regulatory floodways in AE zones on the map. So you're going to be able to see in those higher detail study areas the flood elevations at certain cross sections. You're going to be able to see the location of the floodway. And then they also show community landmarks. So this would be city name, corporate boundaries, major roads, intersections, any natural identifying features, so whether that be lakes or something like that. The floodplains that are shown on the flood insurance rate maps, those are the areas we use to regulate at the state and local levels, because again, those are the floodplains. The flood insurance rate maps, they are official legal documents, so they are legally enforceable. That's how we're able to use these to make management or regulation decisions. They are adopted into the state regulations and into your all's local ordinances. So any community that participates, the maps are adopted into your local ordinance. Those are what we use. When they're put together, they're made using the best available data at the time. Like I said, we try to make them as accurate as we can make them because we want to make sure we're conveying good information to people, trying to put good information in their hands. And because of that, because they're incorporated into reg and ordinance, and because they are the official legal documents, they're considered correct until you prove them wrong. So if you disagree with the maps, it doesn't matter. The maps are what they are. We have to use them. We have to regulate by them. The other thing that comes along with the maps is the flood insurance study. So these are, apologies. This is the background information for why the flood maps look the way they look. So the flood insurance study shows you several things, including what areas did we study, summary of discharges, how much water is flowing through certain points in that study, engineering and mapping methods, how did we put them together, flood elevation profiles, data tables, several other things. They are telling you why the maps look the way they look. And then there's also additional references for the flood study itself that are provided in the flood insurance study, and they come along with the maps. So again, we talked earlier, the maps are considered correct until you prove them wrong. But the map is a snapshot in time. We only update the maps on average every 5 or 10 years. There's actually some areas in the state where it's been closer to 15 years since the maps have been updated. And we know that things change over time. I'm sure everybody on this webinar has seen areas in their community where it starts off like that picture, where it's either an open lot or a forested area. And then suddenly a couple months later, you turn around and it's a Walmart or a new subdivision or something like that. Those areas have completely different risk levels when we're talking about flooding. Those open areas or wooded areas, there's nothing there for it to flood the damage. So if the water comes up, nobody really cares. But when you're talking about a commercial development or a subdivision, those are areas where people have invested a lot of time and money and effort. They want to keep them dry. So, as the maps, as flood risk changes over time, the maps need to be updated to show those changes in flood risks. There's two ways that you can update flood insurance rate maps. The first one is in a physical map revision. So physically changing the map that is used. Now, this is a long process because, again, it's incorporated by reg and reference. It's a legal document, so there's a due process phase that it goes through to allow people to comment, to make objections, to submit better data. So that is a possibility, but it's generally a long and costly process. The other way the maps are updated is with what they call the letter of map change. This is just an administrative process that is done by FEMA that just supersedes the information shown on the map. And that's exactly what it is. It's a letter that comes out that basically says this area of this location is considered outside the floodplain based on new data. So these letters of map change really do just remove individual properties or sections from the floodplains. You can see in that image there on the left, those purple dots with the writing. Those are areas where letters of map change have been, determinations have been issued. So somebody at that location asked FEMA to take a look, and FEMA said either, yeah, we think you're out, or no, we think you're in, and here's why. So for the ones that are out, it administratively removes them. The map itself doesn't change, but that letter supersedes what's on the map. For those floodplain coordinators that are on the webinar, you should be keeping your letters of map change that come to you. They should be mailed either to you or the community CEO. If you don't have them, don't panic. They are actually available for download today from FEMA's Map Service Center, and I'm going to cover the Map Service Center more in depth here in a little bit. So the letter of map change, like I said, that's just an administrative process, but there are actually several different letters that FEMA sends out. So you've got the letter of map amendment, LOMA, the letter of map revision, LOMAR, and then the letter of map revision based on fill, LOMAR-F. And these letters are really talking about different levels of changes that are going on. So LOMA tends to be the simpler ones. They tend to be properties that are just very clearly out, or when you're talking about single or multiple lots, where you're talking about individual structures. The LOMARs, though, tend to be bigger projects. So these tend to be the subdivisions, commercial developments, stream relocations, roads and bridges, things like that, where it's a much bigger change. There's some engineering and analysis that have gone into it. those tend to be just a little different beast all to themselves. And then the last one, the letter of map revision based on fill, is where you actually change the ground elevation. So you bring in rock or dirt or gravel or something like that and actually raise the ground elevation up to get it above that flood elevation. When you're talking about that LOMA RF, there is a fee associated with it because, there's going to have to be some analysis done to see what's going on. As local officials, though, the ones you see most frequently is the LOMA out as shown and then the LOMA for a single lot. Those are by far the two most common letters of map change that go out. The out as shown is exactly what it sounds like. It is, somebody goes and gets a loan and the bank says you have to carry insurance because you're in the floodplain. And when you look on the floodplain, they're very clearly out of the floodplain. That is essentially, the property owner saying, hey, FEMA, can you take a look at this and tell me I'm out? And FEMA comes back and says, yeah, you're out just based on looking at the map. The other one is a LOMA for a single lot, and that is where the lowest adjacent grade of a property, or essentially the lowest point where dirt touches the foundation of that building, is above that floodplain or above that base flood elevation. So when you get the 1% chance flood, when that happens, water physically wouldn't reach the building, so it's outside the floodplain. When it comes to changing the map, it's left to the the property owners themselves to do the application. Local officials should help them complete the application, but it's their responsibility. We respect property rights in Kentucky. It is their responsibility to complete the application, to obtain the data they need, and to send it in to FEMA for review. Local communities, like I said, though, you should be keeping copies of all the letters of map change issued by FEMA because, and remember, they supersede what's on the map. So these are are official legal documents that you're using. In the past, I've seen them on file either at the Planning and Zoning Department or with the floodplain administrator. And again, if you don't have them, don't panic. It's not the end of the world. They're available for download on the Map Service Center, which, like I said, I'm going to cover later in this presentation. When you're going to change the map for the LOMA for a single lot or a LOMA out as shown, the form you're going to use is what's called the MTEZ. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's easy. It's a one-page front and back form that requires minimal documentation. So for the out as shown, all you have to do is send in a copy of the map, basically showing you're outside the floodplain. For the single lot, you send in an elevation certificate and information showing that that is your property. So a plat map or something like that. Okay. So it looks like we had a question regarding stream relocation. Is there a threshold that triggers map revision? So when you're talking about a LOMAR with stream relocation, anytime you move the stream itself, you really need to reflect that on the maps. So I'm not sure if there's a level you're talking about, but I mean, anytime you're physically moving the stream itself or putting it into a culvert underground or something like that, you're really changing the way water is going to be flowing. Rivers and streams naturally kind of want to move and meander. That's fine. But like I said, it's the man-made change that we're concerned about, where a Lowe's or a Walmart or something comes back in and moves the stream from cutting straight across their parking lot off to the edge or something like that. That's a major change that we definitely want to know about. Again, guys, if you have questions, please feel free to ask in that chat box. Like I said, I am trying to monitor as we go and hit your questions, during my transition. So feel free to ask questions, or like I said, if you want to save it to the end, that's fine. We can do that there too. So now we're going to move on to the Nfip requirements. So we just covered the identification and mapping part. Now we're going to take a look at that second leg of the stool, where we're actually talking about, okay, now we know where those risky areas are. What are we going to make people do about it? So federal requirements, the Code of Federal Regulations, 44 CFR Part 59 and 60 are the parts that deal with the floodplain management. when you look in 60.3, the regulations saying what you have to do in floodplains, the very first one they list, A1, requires permits for all proposed construction or other development in the community, so that it may be determined whether such construction or other development is proposed within flood-prone areas. Essentially, permits are required. That is the very first requirement listed. Everything else is built off that. Other requirements there in 60.3 is, like I said, all necessary permits are obtained, not just the flood ones. You have to get everything. And all the development has to be reasonably safe from flooding. And we're going to talk about what that reasonably safe from flooding means as we go along. If you want to take a look, guys, I've included the hyperlinks. You can actually go and look at the official federal regulations if you're interested. In Kentucky, we have state requirements. So KRS is the Kentucky statute. 151-250 is where we have the authority to issue permits. So no person, city, county, or other political subdivision of the state shall develop in any area located adjacent to a river or stream or in the floodplain of a stream unless plans and specifications for such work has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet and a permit has been issued. So that statute gives us the authority to issue permits in and along streams in Kentucky. And again, links there if you want to go take a look at the statute itself and read the whole thing. But the statute tells us what we shall do. The regulations, so the Kentucky administrative regulations there below tell us how we do it. 401 KAR Chapter 4, Part 60 is where it talks about floodplain regulations. And it says all new construction and substantial improvements of residential structures within the base floodplain shall have the lowest floor elevated to at least the flood elevation. So essentially how we, make sure that things are reasonably safe from flooding is to make sure they're elevated up above that flood elevation. We want to keep it high, we want to keep it dry. There's nothing in the regs or the statutes that say you can't develop or build in these areas. It just says if we're going to do it, let's do it smart so that when it floods, you're not damaged. At the Division of Water, the floodplain management section is the ones responsible for either approving or denying permits based on the proposed development. So you send us an application, we take a look, and we say, yeah, this actually meets state standards, or no, we need these additional things. One of the things I like to point out, guys, when you're talking about this is it uses the term development, not construction. And the reason that is for the longest time, people thought the only time you needed permits is when you were building something. So only time people were getting permits is when they were building houses or installing sheds or something like that. Whereas development is really any man-made change to real estate. So whether you're putting something in the floodplain, taking something out of the floodplain, or moving around what's there, all of that falls under that development kind of umbrella term. Some of the things that we typically permit here at the state level, though, are going to be like stream crossings, bridges, culverts, low water crossings. So buildings, residential and commercial buildings, sheds, garages, things like that. Fill, so anytime you bring material into the floodplain that wasn't there naturally. Anytime you do a stream alteration or relocation. Anytime you build a small water impoundment, or for water and wastewater treatment plants. The floodplain management section really does take a look at all of that. And really what we're looking at, guys, is to, one, make sure you're taking action to protect yourself. Because remember, these are the high-risk areas. It's going to flood at some point. So we want to make sure you're doing things such that you're going to be protected. But then, two, we also want to make sure that what you're doing is not going to cause somebody either up or downstream or across from you to flood. So we want to make sure that if you're doing grading there on your property, you're not going to cause water to run into your neighbor's basement or something like that. So that's really what the floodplain management section is taking a look at when you submit permits or submit applications. Excuse me. Big requirement though, like I said before, all building lowest floors have to be elevated or protected to above the base flood elevation. I'm going to say that again. All buildings lowest floors must be elevated or protected to above the base flood elevation. So basically we want to keep you high and dry. It's going to flood there at some point, so keep your stuff up above it. And when we're saying lowest floor, that actually includes all of your building's utilities, mechanical equipment, and ductwork. Essentially anything that allows that building to function for its primary purpose is considered part of the building, so it needs to be elevated or protected. Great example is I've actually seen a firehouse in the floodplain where the firehouse itself was up high enough, but the backup generator was sitting flat on the ground in the floodplain. If water comes up or when water comes up, that backup generator is going to be damaged, if not unavailable. So that building has some flood risk, even though the building itself is up high enough. So if you take a look there, that picture on the bottom left, that is a house that has been elevated up. You know, everything is open underneath. Really, anything that's damageable is up high. Same way with your equipment. The picture there on the far right, that HVAC unit that is up on that platform, you know, when the water comes up, it's going to be fine. Whereas that smaller picture was one left flat on the ground and got destroyed during the flood. Another requirement, like I said, is state and local floodplain permits are required for all development in a mapped floodplain. So, you know, we have a state program, and then all local communities that participate in the Nfip have a local program as well. So you have to get a permit from both before you're allowed to develop in those areas. So we want your lowest floor elevated up, but what about everything below that? Well, any areas below the base flood elevation need to be made using flood damage resistant materials. These are things that when water gets up, when water gets on them, it's not going to damage you. So metal, concrete, rock, plastic, things like that. If water gets up on those, it's not going to seep into those. You can just hose them off and keep going. The other thing they're looking at below that flood elevation is any enclosed areas below the lowest floor have to be vented. And the reason this is done is because water has a lot of pressure. Water's heavy. And so when you have water on one side of the wall and not the other, it is pushing very hard trying to get in that enclosed space. So when you have water getting up, you can have things like cracks in your foundation or collapsed foundation walls that can cause damage. So these vents actually equalize that pressure. For the Nfip, for the floodplain management, 1 square inch of vent space for every 1 square foot of enclosed space is the requirement. So you're actually, if you have a 500 square foot enclosure below the flood elevation, you need to have 500 square inches of vents. And this is done to equalize that pressure. You have to have a minimum of 2 openings, so you have to have at least 2 vents no matter what. And all the vents need to be within a foot of grade. They need to be close to the ground so that water doesn't have to get up real high before they become in use. Here's a great example of what I mean is, this is a house that is the crawl space underneath, but the flood vents there in that back corner where water would hit it first are more than 7 feet in the air. So you have to have 7 feet of water pushing on that foundation before those vents do anything. So those vents really aren't helping you any. Here's a great example that I really love. I actually took this picture when I was in South Carolina traveling. This is a property where the homeowner essentially took those 8x16 concrete blocks and just turned a bunch of them on their side. It's a little difficult to tell, but there's actually chicken wire across the front of those to keep animals out. Those work perfectly fine as vents. They work automatically. They're close to the ground. They allow water in and out. That's fine. So when people tell me I can't afford flood vents, I like to tell them, yeah, you can. You're already buying the blocks. Just turn them on their side. So something like that works. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to allow that water to equalize. Another floodplain requirement as part of the the National Flood Insurance Program is anytime you're developing in a floodway, you can't put anything there that causes the water elevation to go up. Remember, the floodway is that really dangerous area of the floodplain. It's the area where the water is generally the deepest. It's where it tends to flow the fastest. It's the most dangerous area. So when you're talking about building in there, nothing says you can't. We just say you can't put anything there that causes the water to go up, because remember, that's where the water is deepest. Anybody who wants to develop or build in a floodway, you have to hire an engineer, or excuse me, a professional engineer to do an engineering analysis that shows that the water elevation doesn't go up based on what you're wanting to do. That engineer has to put together a hydraulic model and give it to us along with a no-rise certificate, basically certifying, hey, I did analysis, this is fine. Give you a great example of what I mean by, you can't do things in the floodway that cause the water elevation to go up. So here in Frankfort, this is actually a lot right on the Kentucky River, right downtown. We actually had a gentleman come in who was interested in developing this area shown in the green rectangle. What he wanted to do is he wanted to bring a bunch of fill material in and raise the ground elevation and to do a commercial development on top. And we said, okay, you're going to have to get an engineer and show us that, you doing this is not going to cause the water elevation to go up. And he unfortunately wasn't able to do that, which is too bad because, this is a really great area right on the river. It's very beautiful down there. So he was not able to show no rise. And so unfortunately, we were not able to give him a permit to do this. But again, there's nothing says you can't develop down there. If he'd have done something like this, where you would have had a building elevated on pilings or piers or something like that, something like this would likely not cause the water to go up. It would probably be pretty simple for him to show no rise. And so you could do something like this in the floodway. This is actually an example from the riverside of the flood wall in Newport. So this is an area where, it's on the wrong side of the flood wall, and yet, it's able to be there because it's up so high and not displacing water. The last requirement I want to cover before we move on into some of the local stuff is recreational vehicles. And I want to cover this one because I get this question a lot is what is an RV versus what is a mobile home? For an RV, you're allowed to put them in the floodplain under certain conditions, and you have to meet all of these for it to be considered a recreational vehicle. So it has to be self-propelled, or you have to be able to pull it with a lightweight truck. If you have to back a flatbed in there or have a special moving company or something like that come in and move it, it's a mobile home, it's not an RV. It has to be roadworthy and fully licensed for highway use. So it has to have tires can't be flat, it has to have tags, it has to have insurance. You have to be able to legally take it out on the highway. We've had people in the past say, well, I don't want to move it on the highway, I just want to pull it from one end of my property to the other. And I say it doesn't matter, it has to be fully licensed for highway use, otherwise it's a mobile home. It has to be on site less than 180 consecutive days, so every 6 months you have to move it. You don't have to move it much, you just have to show it's movable. Attached to the site using quick disconnect utilities. So this would be the kind of utilities you see when these things are actually at campgrounds. It's flexible hose and a plug-in to electric or something like that. You can't have permanent plumbing running into one of these because then it's not movable. And you can't have any permanent additions. So I've seen campers with permanent decks attached to them. That one's not mobile. You can't just pull it away. You have to do additional work. So that would be considered a mobile home, not a recreational vehicle. Okay, let me take a look and see. It doesn't look like we had any additional questions, guys, so I'm going to keep moving on as long as you guys are following me. So now, those were floodplain management there at the state and federal levels. Now we're going to kind of drill down a little bit more, and we're going to talk about your local requirements. So every community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program has what's called a Flood Damage Prevention Ordinance on file. And I know that because one of the requirements for joining the Nfip is you have to adopt an ordinance before you're allowed to in. So every community, if you participate in the Nfip, you have one of these on file somewhere. And what the ordinance really is talking about, guys, is it's telling you how floodplains are managed in your community. So it has a section in there for authorization and purpose. Why do we have the legal authority to do this, and what are we trying to accomplish? It has a definition section. So when it says substantial improvement or floodway, what does that term actually mean there in your community? It has provisions. So where does this ordinance apply? How are we going to apply it? How are we going to regulate these areas? It has administrator duties. So who's in charge of the floodplains? What are they supposed to be doing? And then it has development requirements. What are we actually going to make people do? We just had a question come in. How do we find out if our county has an ordinance, and where do we get a copy? Like I said, you should have a copy because you have to have one to be part of the NFIP. Check with your county clerk to see if you have one. I have copies of some, but not all. So, starting locally is always a good place to look. So at the local level, when you're enforcing your ordinance, you're enforcing your local regulations, not FEMA. I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls from people saying, FEMA's making me do this. No, your local, fiscal court, your local city commissioners, your local, magistrates, they are the ones making you do this. They read, thought through, and adopted the ordinance to say how things are going to be managed locally. And what this does is it gives you guys as local communities the ability to go above and beyond the state and federal requirements. You know your communities better than I do. I know your communities better than FEMA does. So it gives you the ability to say, hey, no, we want to go just a little bit further and make things a little bit safer. And when you do that, you're reducing community risk as a whole. The floodplain coordinator, your ordinance generally names your community CEO as the local coordinator. So this would be either your judge executives or your mayors. That's generally who's listed as the floodplain coordinator, but it also gives them the authority to designate somebody to act on their behalf. Coordinators I've seen in the past, I've seen emergency managers, I've seen building officials, planning and zoning officials, city and county clerks, a wide range of who the floodplain coordinator is. But there's somebody in every community that's doing this job. Some of the duties include making floodplain determinations, notifying when permits are required, and then helping them obtain those permits, reviewing local floodplain applications, and then actually issuing a local permit based on that application, inspecting development either during the development or after construction, ensuring compliance to make sure that, when you issue a permit, they're actually doing what you told them to do, and if they're not, issuing a stop work order as needed, and then conducting additional inspections down the road, and then the whole time document, compiling documentation to show that you're doing all these things, because saying you did it and showing you did it are two completely different things. So when I talk about floodplain determinations, what am I actually saying? What it is you're trying to determine, is what this person doing, does it qualify as development? Yes or no? Remember, development is broad. Any man-made change to real estate. So most everything you're doing is going to be development. And then you're trying to determine, okay, is this development in the floodplain or not? If it's not, well, then no permits are required. You're not in that high-risk area. If it is, then we have to start asking questions like, okay, what's the maximum flood elevation at the site? How high do we actually expect the water to get? Because what they're doing is going to be directly affected by information like that. When you're making determinations, there are two main places I essentially tell people to go. The first one is FEMA's MAP Service Center, and then the second is Division of Water's Flood Hazard Portal. I'm going to cover both of these more in depth later as we go. But when you're making determinations, use these two first. In the past, we've had people using things like Google Earth or other sites. But the problem is they are not updated as frequently as the MAP Service Center and the Flood Hazard Portal are. They are kept up to date every night at midnight. You have the most accurate, most up-to-date data. We know that for sure. Whereas some of those other ones are only updated every couple months or years sometimes. So these are the two when you're making determinations that I'm going to tell you to go to first. And again, I'm going to cover them more in depth as we go on later in the presentation. So I get this question a lot is, okay, how am I supposed to issue a permit? What am I supposed to do? So I put together a quick slide to kind of walk you through it. Step one we've already talked about is the floodplain determination. Is it development, and is it in the floodplain? If it is, state and local floodplain permits are required. We see this all the time where people will come and get the state permit and then will run off and start. No, the local permit is also required. If you don't have it, you're developing without a permit. Second step is determine what other permits are required and to go ahead and have them get these first. So these are things like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers 401 permit, Division of Waters floodplain permit, Division of Waters water quality certification, permits for endangered species. I've seen permits for non-coal mining, so like rock quarries or gravel quarries or things like that. So determining what else they need, have them get those first, and then the local permit tends to be one of the last ones you obtain. There are a couple websites I've listed here to help you figure out what other permits may or may not be required. I also have a list of some commonly encountered floodplain permits that I can share with you guys if you'd like. Third step is require them fill out a local application. On the application, they're essentially telling you, I'm going to do these things. You as the local floodplain coordinator, you could provide them guidance on how to complete it, what information you need, what you're looking for. And then the last step is you review that application. And if it's acceptable, if it meets your local ordinance requirements, then you can actually issue them a permit to start. The permit you issue should list what the development is. So is it new construction? Is it a rehab? Is it a historic building? Or are they just doing grading? The permit needs to say what it's doing. And then you should list any specific requirements you have on it. So, do they have to build up to a certain elevation? Are flood vents required? And if yes, how many? Are they only allowed to work within 100 feet of the road? Or do you have to have an elevation certificate when they're done? List that information on the permit itself, because then they're legally required to comply. They can't say I didn't know because you gave it to them. Permit you issue should be on community letterhead, if at all possible, and it has to have either the community CEO or the local floodplain coordinator's signature saying, yeah, this was reviewed and approved. So remember, local ordinances can go above and beyond what the state requires. And so I've actually had this in the past where I would go out and I would say, okay, show me your permits. And they would hand me a big stack of state permits. I'm like, okay, great. Now show me your local permits. And I get deer in headlight looks. If your guys are in the Nfip, local permits are required because your local ordinance can go above and beyond what the state requires. In fact, we go so far as anytime we issue a state permit, one of the conditions on it is such and such community participates in the Nfip, therefore a local permit is required. If you don't get a local permit, the state permit is null and void. So if they don't get a local permit, the state permit does them no good. When you're issuing or when you're reviewing applications, some of the things you need to consider are what type of development are they doing? Because depending on what they're doing, there might be different requirements. Is it a residential building or a commercial building? Is it a barn? Are they bringing in fill? Or is it a historic building? All these things have different requirements that go into them. You need to consider what flood zone we're in, and are we in the floodway, yes or no? If you are, certain things apply. What's our flood elevation? How high do we expect that water to get? Once we know that, how high is the lowest floor on that building? Again, the requirement is you got to be high and dry. Are there any local, higher standards? Do we have freeboard? Do we have setback requirements? Things like that. We need to consider those. And then the last one is going to be the cost of the development versus the market value on an existing building. So if you have a house there and they're doing something with it, how much money are they going to be spending versus how much money is that house currently worth? And is that, substantial? And we're going to talk about substantial here in just a minute. Next duty we're talking about the inspection and enforcement. So this is going to be, taking a look. So telling them what to do with the permit is great, but actually making sure they do it is something completely different. Best time to inspect is during construction, not after. If you go out after somebody finishes building them a house and say, hey, you need to elevate that thing up 6 more inches, it's not high enough, they're going to look at you with blank stares. They're going to think you're crazy. Whereas if you come out and look at it after they got the foundation in, you can really easily say, hey, that's not high enough. You need another row of bricks to make sure you're up above that flood elevation. That's much easier than doing it after the fact. Some of the common things we look for whenever we're doing inspections are going to be looking at fill. Is it placed where they told us it was going to be? Is it as high as they said it was going to be? Are they compacting it? Things like that. Want to look at the footing. If there were any setbacks, are they far enough away from the roads or waterways? And does the location they told you actually match what they said on the application? We want to look at the foundation. So what's that lowest floor elevation? Is it going to be up high enough once they're done? If it has a crawl space, is the interior grade at or above the exterior grade? If you have a crawl space and the inside is lower than the outside on all four sides, well, I got bad news. That's not a crawl space. That's a basement, and you're going to pay for insurance for that. Are flood vents required, and if so, are they present? Are they all within a foot of grade? Things like that. And then on manufactured homes, they have to be on permanent reinforced pilings. They cannot be just on those dry stack blocks. They have to be on something permanent because those dry stack blocks are going to be knocked over as soon as you get moving water hitting them. And that manufactured home has to be properly anchored to those permanent and reinforced pilings. Lastly, when you're doing inspections, take pictures, because then you always have something to refer back to. The day I was there, this is what it looked like. So when you come back 6 months or a year, 5 years later, and something's different, you could say, hey, now wait a second, you were supposed to do this. It has to stay this way. And you had something to refer back to show at the time of the inspection it was the way you're supposed to. So I mentioned a couple slides back about the substantial, the cost of the improvement or the cost of the repair versus the market value. What that's referring to is in your ordinance, there is a substantial damage and a substantial improvement section. Substantial damage is any time your building is damaged, if the cost to repair it is 50% or more than what that building's worth, it's considered substantial. So if I have a building worth $100,000, it gets flooded and it's going to cost me $60,000 to put it back the way it was, that's substantial. That's over 50%, that's at or above 50% of the market value. Same way with the improvement. If I have a building and $100,000 building and I'm doing a $60,000 addition onto it, that improvement is 50% or more of the market value before I started the work. Here's why that gets important is anytime the work is considered substantial, you have to protect the entire building from flooding, not just, the damage you're repairing or not just the improvement you're doing. The reason being is you're already spending a significant amount of time, money, and effort into fixing or improving that building. Why would you do that and then leave it at risk of flooding? So this kind of forces people to say, hey, if you're going to do this level of improvement or this level of repair, let's go ahead and take action and protect the whole building so that in the future a flood doesn't happen or a flood doesn't damage it when it happens. Some of the different factors that can lead to a substantial damage or a substantial improvement determination include things like anytime you have flooding in or above the first floor, deep water, it's going to be pretty much substantial. Anytime you have water up for an extended amount of time or extended duration, that water is going to seep into everything, your wood, your drywall, your insulation, your electronics. So it's going to be pretty much substantial. Anytime you have high velocity, so anytime you have, fast-moving water hitting it, you could have cracks in your foundations, your building could be knocked off its foundation, something like that. Or, and this is the one that usually surprises people, it's damage of any origin. It doesn't have to be just flood damage. So if you have a tornado or a fire, high winds, earthquake, hail, locusts, doesn't matter. If a building in the floodplain is damaged and the cost to fix it is 50% or more than its market value, you need to take action to protect it from flooding, even if it was damaged by a fire, because it's still in the floodplain. It's still at risk of being flooded. So while you're spending all this time and money and effort putting it back the way it was or improving it, let's go ahead and protect it from floods going forward. Okay, it looks like we had a couple questions come in, so I'm going to address those before we move on, guys. If a person wants to develop a pond on their property, does that need a permit? The short answer is if it's in the floodplain, yes. Remember, development is broad. Any man-made change to real estate. So even though they might be digging a hole and making it better, you're changing the way water flows. You're changing where water goes during those flood events. So we want to take a look and make sure that one, it's going to be safe, and then that two, you're not affecting other people negatively. I've been trying to create a permit to use. Can you send out some examples, or is there a location to look for them? So I actually have templates of floodplain applications, floodplain permits. stop work orders, notices of violations, things like that. So if you guys don't have permits of those things, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to share those with you. Like I said, the templates are just pre-made. All you got to do is fill in the blanks and then put them on your community letterhead. So you can use those going forward then. Okay, so we're going to move on, guys. Now we're going to talk about some of the floodplain stakeholders. So we were talking about the floodplain management. Now we're moving over to that third leg of the stool. We're going to talk more about the insurance side of it. So we talked about where are risky areas and what are we going to make them do. Now we're going to talk about the insurance. So there are several different stakeholders that care about the National Flood Insurance Program, and one of them is going to be the lenders. Anytime lenders make a federally backed loan or a mortgage, if it's in a floodplain, they are required by law to have that property owner carry flood insurance. Non-optional. If it's in the floodplain and you got a federally backed mortgage or a federally backed loan, you got to carry flood insurance. Lenders are also given the option to where even if a house or a building or development is not in the floodplain, they can still require flood insurance on that if you want a loan from them. Reason being is they're protecting themselves. It's, you're borrowing the money from them, so they're protecting their investment. If a homeowner disagrees with the lender saying they need flood insurance, they can go through that letter of map change process we talked about earlier to get a determination letter to either say a property's out or have it removed. If that happens, more often than not, the lender will drop the insurance requirement. But even still, every once in a while, they will still say, no, we want you to carry flood insurance no matter what. So even if you get a letter of map change, the lender still may require flood insurance. Another stakeholder that's going to be pretty important when we're talking about, the flood insurance program is insurance agents. They use the flood insurance rate maps and other basic information about your building to rate policies. And the way they rate those policies is based off your risk. So think about, car insurance. If you're a risky driver, you have higher premiums. Same thing happens with your flood insurance. If you have a building that is too low or that has a high level of flood risk, you pay higher premiums based on that. When they're using just basic information and the flood insurance rate maps, agents tend to be a little conservative. So they tend to, round up or down depending on the factors that work into their favor. The best way to rate flood insurance, though, is with an elevation certificate. It's always preferable because it's always considered best available data. What the elevation certificate does is it shows your structure exactly in comparison to the flood elevation. So, the maps we make nowadays are accurate, usually to where anywhere within 3 to 5 inches or something like that, whereas the elevation certificate gets you to within 1/10 of an inch. It is always the best available data. When you're talking about insurance agents, though, an improperly located building or an improperly built building affects how much the property owner and the policyholder actually pays on insurance premiums. And I'm going to give you guys an example of what I mean. So here we've got a building that I wanted to build. You can see that blue line, that's our base flood elevation. That's how high we expect the water to get. So when I build my building, I'm going to build it right. So everything below that flood elevation, I'm going to make sure is made of flood damage resistant materials. And if we look, everything is. It's all concrete, brick, plastic, or metal. So all that's good. Since it's on a crawl space, I'm going to make sure I have flood vents in it to equalize that pressure so that water can get in and out without actually cracking or damaging my foundation. I live in a community that is kind of progressive when it comes to floodplain management. My community actually has a freeboard requirement. Freeboard is, requiring somebody to build higher than that flood elevation. So generally 1 or 2 feet higher. So we have a freeboard requirement. I built to that. When my insurance agent comes out and looks at all this, he's going to say, okay, based on this, it was built right. Your lowest floor is going to be there. That is where your risk starts. Everything below is very low or minor risk. Everything above that line, though, is where you're starting to find things like drywall, insulation, carpet, appliances, things like that. But let's say something goes wrong. Let's say either the builder, when he's putting this together, forgets to put the flood vents in, or me as a property owner not knowing any better, I go and block up or take out the flood vents. Well, what happens then? The insurance agent is going to come back and say, okay, well, those flood vents are gone. You could have something happen to your foundation. So now your lowest floor is no longer up there where your living room's at. It's down here where your crawl space starts. That's where your risk starts. So you're going to pay insurance premiums. Anytime you're below below the base flood elevation, you're higher risk, so your premium goes up. Anytime you're above it, you're lower risk, your premium goes down. So by just forgetting flood vents, I'm paying for an extra 18 inches of risk that may or may not actually be there. So something as simple as going back and installing those vents can really fix that problem. And the reason being is, like I said, guys, you could have foundation walls crack or collapse because they're not properly vented. Okay, so how you build or how we require people to build in those high-risk areas really does affect them on the bottom line when it comes to their insurance premiums, when it comes to their resale value, things like that. The other big stakeholder we're interested in, though, is going to be the private citizens. So this is going to be your property owners or your homeowners, your business owners, things like that. When they comply with these the floodplain management requirements, it reduces their risk. And like I said, by complying, it reduces their premiums as well. So they're going to be saving money. The other thing with the flood insurance, though, is, having flood insurance is going to make them whole when a flood happens. Remember, it's not if it floods, it's when it floods. So when a flood happens, flood insurance is really there to put them whole. And they're not reliant on federal disaster assistance or something like that. Give you a great example. During Hurricane Harvey, Harris County, Texas, which is where Houston is at, the average flood insurance claim from Hurricane Harvey was about $113,000. That is money to help put your house back or hopefully in a better position so that it doesn't flood again. But that money is there to make you whole. The average individual assistant grant that came out to the people that didn't have flood insurance was about $4,200. That's just enough money for you to buy some clothes, to get stuff on your back, or to go get a hotel while you figure out what you're going to do next. And those individual assistance grants are generally done in the form of a loan. They want that money back. It's not just yours to keep. It's just yours to help currently. So having insurance really does put you back whole. Here's something I hear a lot. Insurance is not available in my community because I'm not in the floodplain. Yes, it is. If you're in the floodplain or out, if your community participates, you can get flood insurance. So regardless of your flood zone, you can get insurance. And this is important because people tend to think, I have homeowners insurance, I'm covered. Homeowners insurance specifically does not cover flooding. It's too risky for the policy itself, so you have to get an additional policy. So make sure you have flood insurance. Make sure people understand that your homeowners is not going to cover flood risk. Okay, no questions have come in, guys, so I'm going to keep rolling. And again, if you have questions, please don't be shy. Send them to me in that chat feature. I'm more than happy to answer them as we go. So the community rating system. So we talked about the stakeholders. Now we're going to talk about insurance as a whole. So in Kentucky, we have just over 20,000 active flood insurance policies. That sounds like a lot until you realize there's more than 140,000 buildings in the identified floodplain in Kentucky. So that 20,000 policies only accounts for about 15% of the total flood risk that's out there. And it's actually lower than that because not all of those policies are in the floodplain. Some of them are outside in those X zones that are very low risk. So there's a lot of flood risk out there, and insurance really is needed to kind of offset that. Currently, we have about $3.5 billion in total insurance coverage in Kentucky. And since 1978, since the beginning of the Nfip, the program, there's been about $350 million of insurance claims paid out in the Commonwealth. So the community rating system, what this is a voluntary program that rewards and recognizes communities that go above and beyond the minimum. So to be in the Nfip, you have to issue permits and you have to build to at least flood elevation and so on. The CRS realized, though, these other communities are doing more. They have freeboard, they have setback requirements, they have open space requirements, things like that. So we want to reward those. And this is done on a community basis. CRS program is a points-based system. So for every 500 points a community earns, they go up one CRS class. Everybody starts at a 10. So you earn 500 points, you go from a 10 to a 9. Each CRS class is worth 5% savings on flood insurance premiums. So at a class 9, I get 5% discount. If my community goes from a 9 to an 8, that's 1,000 points, that's a 10% discount. Highest you can go is CRS class 1, that's a 45% discount on flood insurance. If you're interested in that, Christina Groves is our CRS specialist for Kentucky. She's the one who actually would rate your community and system, but reach out to me first to help you kind of walk through this process. Goals of the CRS, though, are kind of similar to the Nfip. We want to reduce flood damage to insurable property. We want to make sure that buildings and things that are insurable aren't being damaged so that we don't have to pay insurance out on those. If they're built high and dry to these higher standards, they're less likely to get damaged. CRS is trying to strengthen and support the insurance aspects of the Nfip. So again, if the insurance doesn't cost as much, people are more likely to have it. And then encourage a comprehensive management or a comprehensive approach to floodplain management. So not just thinking about issuing permits, but saying, hey, this area over here, let's use it as a ballpark, or let's leave it empty rather than let somebody build on it. So it really is a big picture view of floodplain management. In Kentucky, currently we have 34 communities participating in the CRS program. The average rating on those communities is a CRS class 8, which is a 10% savings on insurance premiums, on flood insurance premiums, which works out to about $85 per policy in those communities. So those people who have flood insurance in those communities just save $85 because of what the community is doing. That homeowner and that property owner has had to do nothing to get that savings. So that's a big benefit when you're talking about, hey, look at this great stuff we're doing for you. The highest one in Kentucky is Louisville. They are a CRS class 3. I think they are like top 7 or 8 in the country. Everybody in Louisville in the floodplain with flood insurance gets a 35% discount, which is huge. You're talking more than a third of your premium is being saved because of what Louisville Metro is doing. That is kind of incredible. So moving on to the mitigation, that we've been talking about the flood insurance and the stakeholders and who cares about this floodplain management. Now we're going to move on to that last leg, that flood mitigation. So what we're talking about here is, again, taking action to reduce the risk of loss of life and damage to properties during a disaster. Flood insurance program, we specifically care about flooding, but there are other hazards out there like tornado, wind, fire, earthquake, things like that. So mitigation doesn't just apply to flood, but we're going to specifically talk about flood because that's what we're talking about today, is the flood insurance program. Mitigation can happen at any time. It doesn't have to be after a flood. It can actually happen before or during a flood event. To help with this, there are a lot of funding sources out there. There's a big benefit to taking action to reducing risk. For flood mitigation, for every $1 invested, the average savings is something like $7 back. So for every $1 you put into mitigation, you're actually seeing a $7 return on that investment, which is really great. I mean, it's really easy to sell people of, hey, in the future when the flood happens, you won't have to pay, and you're going to be saving money because you're not having to close roads or buy out people or provide shelter or services and things like that. So it's a huge benefit. FEMA's actually put together a really great booklet called Mitigation Ideas, simple enough, that really talks about identifying and evaluating different mitigation actions depending on what hazard you're actually interested in. So this booklet actually covers 17 different types of hazards, including flooding. And when you look at the flooding section, there are 23 ideas in there for actions and ideas you can take to reduce flood risk. And this includes things like buyouts, elevations, relocation. But then it also talks about things like planning, flood warning systems, having higher standards in your ordinance, things like that. Those are all still considered mitigation options. It doesn't have to be the big project that costs tens of thousands of dollars. It can be something as simple as updating your ordinance to include higher standards, or being more conservative when you're talking about what areas does your floodplain apply to, or things like that. If you want a copy, that hyperlink is there. That'll take you straight to it. You can download a PDF off the internet. There are a lot of funding sources out there, and I'm going to cover just a couple that I think are key. The first one that most everybody's familiar with is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. This is a grant program that comes after there's been a disaster declaration. So we had a disaster back in February and early March. So is currently about $8 million of HMGP money out there for mitigation right now. This grant program is designed to help communities implement mitigation measures after a declared disaster. So I said, $8 million. The disaster was about $41 million, and Kentucky being an enhanced state, showing we do really good things. When you give us this money, we get 20% of that money for the HMGP grant program. The way it works is FEMA generally funds 75% of the grant. State of Kentucky, we kick in 12%, and then the local community is responsible for 13% of the grant. So, give you an example is my $100,000 house, it got flooded, I want to buy it out. FEMA kicks in $75,000, Kentucky kicks in $12,000, and then the local community is responsible for 13 grand. So for 13 grand, you're buying a $100,000 house. It's a pretty good deal. And then on top of that, there's actually Department of Local Government may have funds that can cover up to 75% of that local share. So instead of kicking in 13 grand, it would be $3,000 or $4,000. So it's a really good deal and a really cost-effective way to reduce risk, because my house got flooded once. It's likely going to happen again. That's a good, indicator of future flood risk. So this grant program is really great, guys. So if you have questions, Jenny Jo is our state hazard mitigation officer. Her information is on the next slide. I'd encourage you to reach out to her. The other two grant programs I want to cover are going to be the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. These are both pre-disaster. So these are before the disaster hits, let's go ahead and take action. The pre-disaster mitigation is there to implement pre-disaster mitigation actions. So this would be things like planning, stormwater, stuff like that. Whereas the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant is more for reducing long-term risk to insurable properties. So that one's more often used for buyouts, relocations, elevations, things like that. These two grants are open annually, so about once a year they come open. We try to broadcast them very loudly when they come so that everybody's aware of them. And they're nationally competitive. So each state gets an automatic allocation, but all the remaining funding, they prioritize projects based on a set of priorities or set of things they want to focus on. Kentucky, we've, again, been really good about this. I think we had more than 8 or 10 projects last year that were funded through this. So it's really great. So I encourage everybody, if you're interested in this stuff, reach out to Jenny Jo. She's a great resource. She can help you out. Her email's there at the bottom of the slide. Other funding out there is going to be things like increased cost of compliance funding. So ICC money is a standard part of all flood insurance policies. So if you have flood insurance, you're already paying for the ICC, you might as well get some benefit of it. To get that money, there's 3 things that have to happen. You have to have flood insurance, you have to be in a floodplain, and your building's got to be substantially damaged. If those 3 things happen, on top of your flood insurance claim, you can actually get up to $30,000 additional to help cover the cost of doing a mitigation action. So when you're rebuilding your house to elevate it up, or if you want to relocate it else, there's an additional 30 grand out there that can help you do that. I mentioned it before, DLG's Flood Control Matching Grant Program can sometimes help to meet local cost shares requirements. So reach out to DLG. I put their website there, so they might have money to help. If you can't do that full 13% for the HMGP or something like that, DLG might be able to help. The last one I want to cover, guys, and this is one that I think is really underutilized in Kentucky, is HUD's 203K loan program. So if you go to a bank and request a loan to do a mitigation action, one of the things people tend to struggle with is banks want a certain loan-to-value ratio. So they're loaning you this money. They want you to add a certain amount of value to your house for that money. And when you're talking about doing a mitigation action, that's not always or not often possible. So this 203K loan program allows you to get around that requirement. So you can actually get a loan that will pay off your mortgage and then puts the rest of the money into an account to allow you to do this mitigation action. And some of the things you can do with this are structure elevations of the home to above flood elevation, relocations, wet or dry flood proofing on commercial or non-residential structures, relocating utilities, things like that. So this is one that I feel is underutilized in Kentucky. That would be really great. I think folks need to look into this more. Okay. Doesn't look like any questions have come in, so I'm going to just kind of keep on rolling. So we've talked, like I said, about the National Flood Insurance Program kind of as a whole. We started big, talking about what the goals are, what are the federal requirements, what are the state requirements, what are your local requirements, and then we went into the insurance and mitigation aspect. Now we're going to kind of transition a little bit. So rather than talking about the program itself, we're going to talk about some of the tools that are out there that kind of help you implement your local programs or help you make decisions. So we're going to talk about some of the flood risk tools. And the first thing I want to say about this, guys, there are a lot of tools out there. I'm only going to cover a couple of the ones that I think are the most pertinent, for local officials and floodplain managers, planning and zoning, building, things like that. But there are a lot out there. So there's USGS, FEMA, NOAA, FloodSmart, UK's Kentucky Geological Survey, CAM. There's a lot out there. But like I said, I'm just going to hit some of the highlights so I don't spend all day talking, kind of geeking out on some of this stuff with you guys. First big one, I mentioned it earlier, is FEMA's Map Service Center, or MSC. This is FEMA's online digital repository or online digital library of all flood risk information for the entire country. So if you go to the Map Service Center, you can look at on that image to the right, you can see the maps themselves, but you can also download information. So you can download the flood insurance rate maps. Those are the official legal documents. You can download the flood insurance studies, so the background information. Why does my map look this way? The letters of map change, any of those administrative changes for the flood insurance program, those are available. But then they also have non-reg products, which are specifically geared towards risk communication. An example of those non-reg products is when you're looking at the flood insurance rate map, it might say, flood elevation is 487.3 feet above sea level. What does that actually mean? Most people don't know where their house sits in relation to sea level, so it doesn't mean a whole lot to people. Whereas those non-reg products will say something along the lines of, hey, during the 1% flood, water is going to be 3.5 feet deep at your front steps. And that really changes the way people think about it, because they're like, oh, wow, 3.5 feet, that's going to be water in my living room. I need to do something about this. So it changes the way they think about their flood risk. When you go there, you can search in the search bar by a lot of different methods. You can do location, so state, county, city, mailing address, lat long, something like that, and use that to actually search around to find your appropriate product. The website there at the bottom is msc.fema.gov/portal. Additionally, those flood insurance rate maps we talked about are big. They are something along the lines of 2 feet by 3 feet. They're big. If you don't have a plotter, you really can't print them. So one of the tools FEMA built into the Map Service Center is a way to make what they call a ferment, which is just when you print off a small section of those official maps onto an 8.5 by 11 standard sheet of paper. So the way this works is on the left, you see where I just went in and looked for Frankfort, Kentucky, looking at the capital. You're actually able to go in and click around, and you're dropping that red pin on areas you're interested in. Okay, so find a site you want to look at, drop your pin, and then you hit that dynamic map tool where it says print map/ferment. And what that's going to do is in 30 seconds or a minute, it's going to create a PDF of the area I'm interested in. So you see there in the middle of that map on the left, there's a pin where I clicked. That tells me, hey, the area you're interested in is in the floodplain. And then it also has the same information that the firm has on it. So it's got all the legend and the key and all the information there. It's got the legal jargon, the north arrow, cross sections, all that information. It's all still there. So this is still an official legal document. And to give you an idea of how much better these firms are versus the entire panel is, both of these red circles shown on these two maps are about the same size. So the firm allows you to print just the area you're interested in rather than the entire map itself. So this is great when you're talking about issuing permits or property owners wanting to know, are they in or out or something like that. You can actually make these, print them off, give it to them, or they're PDFs. You can save them, you can email them, whatever you need to do with them. They're great tool to have that I think more people should be using. The next one I want to talk about is the Kentucky Flood Hazard Portal. So this is a website done by the Division of Water that shows all of Kentucky floodplains on a single map. So the Map Service Center is everything in the country. This one is Kentucky specific. And it actually shows the same flood information that the Map Service Center does. We're actually pulling data from the same place they are. So what you see on the FEMA maps is the same thing you're going to see on the Flood Hazard Portal. The benefit of using this, though, is there are some additional tools built in that the FEMA site doesn't have. So I mentioned before, the flood insurance rate map has base flood elevations and AE zones actually shown on the map. Or if they're not shown on the map, you can go to that flood insurance study, the stream profiles, and actually figure out what the elevation is for your site. But what about when you get out of those, areas? What about when you get off the big rivers or out of the cities and get out into the counties? How do you find flood elevation information? Well, it's available through the portal. 119 of the 120 counties actually have A-zone base flood elevations available. The one county we don't is Jefferson County, and that was done intentionally because Louisville MSD already provides that information, so there's no reason for us to recreate the wheel. The way it works is you zoom in, so that picture on the bottom, you zoom into the area you're interested in, you click that stream center line, that blue line showing where the stream's at, and you get a results box. And in that results box, it's actually going to tell you the base flood elevation for where you clicked. And as you move up and downstream, that number is going to change because water flows downhill. So that information is going to change kind of as you go. Additionally, you can actually download the hydraulic models that were used to put these maps together. So you see below that flood elevation where it says download model here. You can actually click that and download the model that we use to make the official map. So for engineers that are needing to show rerouting a stream or putting in a new commercial development or something like that, they can start with our official model. They don't have to go back and recreate it from scratch. Other information is available, so the hydrologic and hydraulic reports are available, and then copies of the flood insurance studies are available there as well. Eventually, though, we want to have some of that non-reg, some of that flood risk information put on the portal, and we would like to show eventually some dam safety information. So if you live downstream of a dam and you're not in the floodplain, you might still be at risk if something would happen to that dam. We would like to show that information as well one day, but we're just not quite there yet. So that's kind of in our phase 2. If you want to go to the portal, it's watermaps.ky.gov/risk-portal. Another really cool map that we put together at the Division of Water is the flood map project updates. So I mentioned earlier, Division of Water, we are the CTP, we are the cooperating technical partner with FEMA for updating the flood maps in Kentucky. While we go through this process, towards the end, we actually have maps put together that we need people to take a look at and, see if they can spot errors. So one of the ways we do this is as these preliminary maps are available, we put them up on the website. They're not there to be used for the regulatory portion of it. They're more there just as an FYI to let you know, hey, maps are changing, here's what they're going to look like. And then people would say, I disagree with this, let me provide a different engineering model, or this road name is wrong, it needs to be changed to this. So we want to make the maps as accurate as we can while we go through these updates. And sharing this information is one of the best ways to do this. Currently, if you go to that site, there are 4 maps or 4 areas up there for review. So Jefferson County's getting new flood maps. Silver Little watershed, which is like Oldham, Trimble, Carroll County, that area. Part of the Lower Kentucky watershed is coming up, and then Spencer County, they had a levee accreditation go through, so they're getting some new maps. Once these preliminary maps kind of go through their due process phase, remember, they're legal documents. They have, places for people to comment or object or things like that. Once they go through that due process phase and they go into effect, we actually take them off of this site and put them on the flood hazard portal. So again, these are just there as an FYI. Once they go into effect, once we start regulating by them though, they go on the Map Service Center and the flood hazard portal. If you want to take a look at these, watermaps.ky.gov is the web page, and it's there towards the bottom. One of the really cool features, though, with these flood map updates, though, I want to call out is you can look at the preliminary maps. So you see in the bottom center, this is what the preliminary maps look like for part of Jefferson County, Louisville. And this is great because it'll tell you, are you in the floodplain or not? But what about if you're only interested in the areas that change? Some of these houses were in the floodplain before and they still are. Some were in there and aren't in the new maps. So one of the things we're able to do is we're actually able to show what's called changes since last firm that shows you where the maps changed. So these different colors actually show you where the floodplain either got bigger or they got smaller. Everything in gray, you were in the floodplain before, you're still in the floodplain. There was no change. Areas in red and green is where the floodplain either is getting bigger, so the 1% or the 0.2% chance floodplain got bigger, and then blue and yellow is where they shrunk. So if you look at these areas circled in purple, those areas in red are newly mapped into the floodplain. The floodplain was always there, but now we know it's there. So these are the areas where they were out previously and now they're in. So these are areas where you want to make sure you communicate very clearly to people, hey, you were always in the floodplain, but now we know it. So you're able to do more targeted outreach to community members when the maps change. So this is really cool. We're really excited about this. We think it'd be really helpful for people, going forward to use this. Another really cool tool is USGS's flood inundation mapping. And what the flood inundation map is geared to do is it helps them or enables them to make cost-effective mitigation decisions before the flood happens. So USGS works with a lot of other federal and state partners to make these maps. And what you can use them for are things like preparedness, doing what-if scenarios. What if the river gets this high? Where's the water going to go? It allows you to do timely response. So hey, when the river gauge gets to this elevation, this road gets up closed. So I need to go ahead and have the gates up and things like that, closing the road before that happens, because I don't want to risk somebody driving through a flooded roadway. It allows you to do recovery planning, so you can do a damage assessment. Hey, I know the water got this high. Where do I need to spend my time and effort to make sure that these areas, are getting permits or getting the help they need? And then lastly, planning. You can, use these for hazard mitigation planning. If you're interested in it, that's the website below, but I want to show you guys an example of what I mean. So this is the flood inundation map for downtown Frankfort, and I'm going to call your attention to these 2 areas circled in red, because I think they're really great examples showing how this flood inundation map works. So in the box to the left, the one that's flashing, this is actually the river gauge, and you're able to take this slider bar and move it up and down, and you're changing the gauge elevation. And as you do that, the area shown in blue that's inundated on the map is going to change. So right now, the 2 red circles, this is right as you're hitting the minor flood stage. Well, what happens if you took it all the way up to the major flood stage? Where would the change be? So keep an eye on those 2 red circles as we cycle through this. So you're able to see as that gauge goes up, these areas are getting bigger and smaller as I'm moving that gauge around. So, when you move the gauge up to 40 feet, for example, Benson Valley Road there in that top circle is inundated. As an emergency manager, as a planner, we know we need to go close this if the river's going to get that high. Same way, that bottom circle, the one on the right, when the river gets to this stage, Highway 420 through there is going to be closed. So me, personally living downtown, my commute to work is about to get a lot longer because I can't take the normal route. So it allows you to plan ahead of time. And then they also go and do plans for the flood of record. So the flood of record in Frankfurt, I think, is 49 feet. This gauge, they have it mapped out all the way up to 52 feet. And if you take it all the way to the top, it actually, I did it again. It actually shows you that the flood wall in downtown Frankfurt would be overtopped. And so big sections of the city would be flooded. So, when the river gauge gets up to that high, this is above the flood of record, so it would be a substantial flood, but it allows emergency managers to say, oh, wow, we need to evacuate these areas right now. Another great tool is National Weather Service has the Advanced Hydrologic Predictive Service. Most of Kentucky is shown in the Ohio Basin region of the AHAP system, but what the National Weather Service is doing is it's showing live river observations in real time, and they're color-coded to show, what the river elevation, the river observation is in comparison to the flood, elevations. So the different colors mean different things. So in that image to the right, everything in green is not flooding. Yellow is near flood stage, orange is minor flooding, red moderate flooding, and then purple is major flooding. So you're actually able to see, oh, wow, these areas are flooding right now. I need to be concerned about them because that water is coming down to me. The Weather Service, the site, if you want to take a look at it there, is at the bottom. You're also able to go, so for each one of those green dots on that previous page, you can actually go in and look at the individual gauge information as well. So when you look at the gauge, you're able to see the hydrograph, which is, where the water has been and where it's projected to go. So on that picture to the right, everything in blue, that blue line is the observed. So what's the water level been doing the last week? Everything in purple is where it's projected to go. So you can see on this, the river's high right now, but it's projected to go down over the next couple weeks. Again, I mentioned that color coding, the red, yellow, orange, and purple. That corresponds with the flood elevations there. So, flood stage at, Grand Chain Lock and Dam on the Ohio River is 42 feet. Moderate flooding is 48, and then major flooding is 53 feet. It also shows you, when you get up high, the record flood. So what's the highest the water's ever been? So these hydrographs really give you an idea of, oh, is the water going up or is it going down? They also have probability graphs. So what's the probability based on some of the models that there's going to be some type of flooding in the next few months? You can take a look at that. You can look at river at a glance. So I'm able to look at the entire Kentucky River all at once and see, oh, where's the water, when's it going to hit next? You can look at individual information or historic crests of it. So there's a lot of really great information for the AHAP system. Additionally, you're actually able to look at regions, and they include up to 48 hours worth of projected rainfall into their projections. So this is one I took back in February. Like I said, we had a flood disaster. Right at the beginning of it, you'll see at this, the observed river observations are pretty good. There's a lot of green in that map. There's a couple yellows there along the Mississippi and the Ohio near Kentucky Lake. And then a little bit north of us there in the Wabash Valley, there's a little bit of flooding. So this looks pretty good. But if you notice at the top, this is the river observations. If you go over to the very next tab and look at the river forecasts that are including this additional rainfall that's coming, you can very quickly see, oh, wow, there's about to be severe flooding in some areas that we need to kind of be concerned with. So you can really see, here's where we're at, here's where we're going. So it gives you a good picture of what the flood is going to look like. That is all I've had, guys, for the tools. Like I said, there are a lot out there. There's more, but those are the main ones I wanted to cover today. It doesn't look like there's any questions that have come in, so I'm going to move on to some of the other training opportunities that are out there. So, again, this is an introductory course. There's more information out there, and I want to share some of the different ways you guys can get that. So, some of the other trainings, FEMA has their Emergency Management Institute. This is an area in Emmitsburg, Maryland you can travel to where FEMA offers 4-day classes that covers other aspects of the NFIP and other parts of floodplain management. The main one I'd recommend for everybody is the Managing Floodplain Development through the NFIP. That is a 4-day introductory course where it basically takes all the information we covered today and you go more in depth. So you look more into the regulations, you look more into the requirements, you make determinations, you learn to read a map, you learn to issue permits and things like that, where they sit you down, show you how it's done, and then have you actually practice that skill so you get good at it. On top of that, the 194 Advanced Floodplain Management Concepts course builds on that. So what are your roles as a floodplain coordinator? What are some of the things you can do to prepare on the front end so that when the flood comes, you're more prepared? And then for those communities that are interested in the community rating system, there's NFIP and CRS class that talks about how points and activities are scored. So if you're going to get into the CRS, that's a good one to cover because it gives you a good idea of what you should be looking at. FEMA will actually reimburse your travel costs to get there. So if you drive, they will pay you mileage, or if you fly, they will reimburse you for your plane ticket and pick you up at the airport. And when you get the EMI, they actually provide you lodging. So the really only cost for people at the local levels to attend is a $125 meal ticket, and that's for you to eat there in the commissary all week. It's a pretty good deal when you're talking about getting the training you need going forward. Another thing EMI does is what they call their independent study or distance learning. It's basically online courses that you can take that are anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes long that cover very specific topics. So some of the ones I wanted to highlight are increased cost of compliance. That's one that often confuses people. Theory of elevation rating, elevation certificates for surveyors, and EC Made Easy, an elevation certificate overview. So if you're interested in those, the website's there below, training.fema.gov/EMI. Another one I want to highlight, guys, is CAM. CAM is the Kentucky Association of Mitigation Managers. So again, I'm a floodplain coordinator. I mainly deal with flooding, but CAM is really all hazards. So tornadoes, earthquakes, landslides, sinkholes, hail, windstorms, whatever. CAM really deals with all of that, and they do a lot of great things. So CAM is actually, they do a state conference every year. This year it's at Lake Barkley State Resort Park. It's September 16th through 19th, so it's coming up a couple months from now, and there's a lot of great information that's provided. It's very cheap to attend. It's like $175 to become a member and then attend the conference. But you get 3 days of great trainings, and then the first day there's a lot of workshops and things like that that go on. So there's a substantial damage estimator workshop. There's I'm doing an NFIP 101 workshop that morning. USGS is talking about some of their gauging information and things like that. So there's a bunch of great trainings that are going on, weather spotting, things like that. But then there's also networking opportunities. So at the CAM conference, you'll find people from FEMA, from EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, National Weather Service, things like that. Then you'll find state partners, Division of Water, Division of Waste, Kentucky Emergency Management, the Department for Local Government, UK, things like that. You'll find contractors and consultants and firms like that offer services that can help you, and then other locals. So it's a great networking opportunity to talk to the people you may need to talk to at the conference. So I highly recommend it. And then CAM also does regional training. So you see the map there on the right. Those are the CAM regions. They hold trainings generally in the spring, so we're already past those for this year. And they spread them out throughout the state, so you don't have to travel all day to do the trainings. Recommend going to their website, kymitigation.org. A lot of great resources on there as well. But reach out, conference, you can go ahead and register for it, and lodging information, all that's available. So I hope to see you guys there at the conference this year. Lastly, guys, I want to cover a couple things, just some key takeaways that I hope you guys all take away from this webinar today to help you going forward. The first one, guys, is remember, it's not just are you in the floodplain or out. Anywhere it rains, it can flood. Everywhere has some level of flood risk. What you're really talking about is how risky is it? Is it high risk? Is it moderate risk? Or is it low risk? So being outside the floodplain doesn't mean you're not at risk of flooding. So anywhere it rains, it can flood. Second key takeaway, guys, is communicating risk is key. If people don't know about a risk, they can't take action to reduce that risk. If you don't know about the sparking wire in your attic, you can't go up there and fix it. So communicating to people where these risky areas are and what you can do to reduce your risk is really key when you're talking about flood risk reduction. And then the last thing, guys, is keep in mind there are tools and resources out there for your needs. Like I said, I covered some. FEMA has a great resource library. There's studies, there's maps, there's all kinds of things out there. But if you're not finding what you need, reach out to me directly. Again, I'm the state floodplain coordinator. I'm here to help in whatever way I can. I've actually had some instances in the past where there just wasn't the information people needed, and so I put a resource together. I put together a guide, or I put together a fact sheet or something like that to give information and to give the data and things that people need. So if you can't find what you need, let me know and I might be able to help. Lastly, guys, when it comes to floodplain, don't panic. Okay, like I said, there are people out there. If I don't have the answer, somebody at FEMA region does. If FEMA region doesn't have the answer, somebody at FEMA headquarters does. If they don't have the answer, then we need to get something going because we need that answer. So when it comes to floodplain management, don't panic. We're here to help. And with that, guys, I want to give you my contact information. So that is my email and my direct phone line. If you're going to contact me, definitely recommend email because I'm in and out of the office quite a bit. If you leave me a voicemail, I will return your call at some point. I don't know when. Usually it's been about a week or 2 weeks before I've been able to return voicemails. But if you email me, I have my email linked to my phone. I can respond anytime I'm on the clock. That's not a problem. Happy to do it. Or if you don't know what you need, reach out to the Division of Water's general contact. So that's the general email and the general phone line. You can call or email there, and they will direct your question to the appropriate people. Lastly, guys, that was all I had for the presentation, so thank you guys for attending. I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes, so if you have questions, go ahead and type them into that chat box. Otherwise, guys, I thank you for all spending a couple hours with me this afternoon. Like I said, hopefully this is going to be the first webinar of many, and we're going to cover several topics going forward, things like CRS and resources and water quality certifications, things like that. So hopefully, you guys got a lot of great information. If you have ideas that you want me to cover, please reach out to me and let me know. Otherwise, guys, thanks, and I'll talk to you later.